Good morning, everyone. I welcome you to this webinar. The time for ancillary services is now, and I have been joined by our eminent speaker. Let me take you through his brief bio and introduce him to all of you. Mr. Saurabh Kumar is the Managing Director, Energy Efficiency Services Limited. Mr. Saurabh Kumar is an Indian Revenue Service Officer of 1992 batch. He is an electrical engineer from Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, and Masters in Public Policy from National Graduate Institute of Policy Studies, Tokyo, Japan. Mr. Saurabh Kumar briefly joined the telecom sector in 1989. In 1992, he got selected in the Indian Revenue Service as Assistant Commissioner of Income Tax. From 1992 until 2002, Mr. Saurabh Kumar worked as a Deputy Commissioner in various sensitive intelligence assignments. In the year 1996-97, he was appointed as the first officer of the tax department in India to levy tax on national political parties. He also worked in the enforcement wing of the Revenue Department and conducted search and seizure operations against tax evaders. As a part of his job, he conducted one of the biggest anti-tax evasion search operation covering 30 cities and over 15 premises on a large industrial group of India, which remains one of the most successful operations in the department. In 2002, Mr. Saurabh Kumar joined the Union Ministry of Power, Government of India as Deputy Secretary in charge of the Budget and Finance Wing with the task of appraising large power projects for government investments. He was part of the government structure that was responsible for taking investment decisions in large power projects. The yearly investment budget handled during 2002-2005 was to the tune of $4 billion US dollars. Mr. Saurabh Kumar has also been in charge of several bilateral projects on energy efficiency with Japan, Germany, France, etc. He proceeded on a UN deputation to Bangkok for 2 years and was handling environmental issues in Asia Pacific region. He has worked for design and implementation of programs for promoting energy efficiency in India, preparing policies for enhancing the offtake of energy efficiency, and has actively handled the international climate change negotiations as a part of the national negotiation team. Mr. Kumar has been appointed as the Managing Director of Energy Efficiency Services Limited by the Ministry of Power, and he took over as the Managing Director of EESL on 6th of May 2013. So it is a very, very impressive profile, and we can't thank you enough for accepting our invitation to come on to this webinar and addressing our faculties and our students. So over to you. Please take over the session.
Thank you, Mr. Bhatnagar. At the outset, let me thank Amity University and in particular, Madam Chavi Jambal, who made that connection. And I must at the outset thank everyone who has joined today. Well, and also thank you very much for a very liberal introduction. I don't think I deserve that much, but anyway, from the introduction, you will see that I'm a jack of all, but possibly master of none. But that's as long as it works, it is fine. Also, let me compliment Amity University for raising a topic, honestly, which has not been raised by many others that I know, at least in India. And even the title is very apt, that the time for ancillary service in India is actually now. So I have a short presentation and will not take more than maybe half an hour, 35 minutes to pull this out. It's more on a conceptual level. And let me be very honest, while I did electrical engineering way back 30 years ago in IIT Kanpur, I'm no longer an engineer. So my talk will be completely non-technical, so as to say, more on the regulatory side, more on the project formulation side, and what needs to be done as far as this particular issue is concerned. So let me try and share my screen. Is it visible now?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so let me begin by what is ancillary services, and why do we need ancillary services? I mean, given that there's a power generation and there is a supply for centuries together, we never needed an animal like ancillary services. Why there's so much of halla about ancillary services? Now, simply speaking, I'll let me mention what it is. It is essentially a power asset. I mean, ancillary services are also power generating stations, but these generating stations are different because they are not used for energy markets. They are only used for balancing. Now, I'm just giving you on the left hand side the first uh, image that you see is a normal functional power market where the demand and supply equally matches. There is a system which makes sure that what is scheduled is actually dispatched, and there is no imbalance in the system. People may recollect 2012, there was a massive supply disruption. There were outages to the tune of 2 or 3 gigawatts, which led to the collapse of the complete grid. And for days together, people were without power. So what happens so in sum, and I'll come back to this topic, you see the scale below. Basically, you need on a real-time basis power or energy into the system or out, or either coming in or going out, to make sure that you balance the grid. Now, what are the kinds of ancillary services? There are 3 kinds of ancillary services that are used. First is primary, and primary is an ancillary services which can respond virtually instantaneously. And I'll give you a couple of examples as we move ahead, either ramping up or ramping down, depending upon whether it's a supply disruption or a demand disruption. The second is secondary ancillary services. Now, this is something which it can respond within 10 minutes, and gas power stations, whether large ones or decentralized, are actually the candidates for this kind of ancillary services. And the third is tertiary ancillary services, which takes more than 10-15 minutes to respond. Now, why they are used and why they are classified as 3 based on their response time? It all depends upon the severity of disruption. So, for instance, let's say I'm Delhi distribution company, and I have scheduled power of 8,000 megawatt. Now, suddenly I realize that my demand requirement 2 hours from now will go down by let's say 1,000 megawatt. Now, when there was no day-ahead market as we now have, naturally what you will do, it's a scheduled power, and suddenly your load drops. But you have half an hour, you have an hour to respond. So what will you do? You will ask a generating station which was otherwise supplying you, a thermal generating station. It will ramp down in about 30 minutes. What if this disruption happens within 10 minutes? The thermal stations can't respond. Technically, you can't just put up and down load in a thermal power stations in less than 15 minutes. So what is the other resource you have? Is gas-based station. They can ramp up very quickly between 5 and 7 minutes. But presuming it just happens in the next 1 minute, now there is no choice. You can't even call up people and shut down the loads. And that is where you need the primary ancillary services. And if you look at the last bullet, and this is picked up from the CERC's assessment that as of 2017, India needs 4 gigawatts of primary, nearly 3.2 gigawatts of secondary, or 3.6 gigawatts of secondary, and 5.2 gigawatts of tertiary ancillary services. 5.2 gigawatt of tertiary ancillary services exist. And it exists in form of the excess capacity that the thermal generating plants have. They are and actually as we speak, in India, it's only the tertiary ancillary services which are in operation, which are being used. The other two are still not being used in India, and we'll come to this. So let me go to my next slide. Same thing, just depicting what I just said. If there's a sudden supply disruption, or there's a enhance in demand, and let me give you an example what happened. 21st of June, some parts of India went through a solar eclipse, and for certain period of time, nearly 13 gigawatt of solar was affected. So this is the left side impact that we are showing, because it happened during the day, where normally it is not a peak demand, the system operator was able to manage. Now look at the right side image. Right side image, suddenly the demand drops. And again, I'll give you an example. 5th of April 2020, the Honorable Prime Minister asked the entire nation to switch off the lights at 9 p.m. If you remember, 9 baje 9 minute was the clarion call. And the call was that you switch off lights at 9 p.m., go to your balcony, light up candles, as we all did. And at 9:09, you will again switch on the lights. Very simple call. What was the impact on the grid? At 9 p.m., 15 gigawatt of load went away instantaneously. In a moment, it just went away. At 9:09, about 13 gigawatt of load came back instantaneously. Yet the grid was balanced. And we'll talk about and that's why I'm saying the topic of this webinar is absolutely bang on, because we have seen this in the last 2 or 3 months, that the kind of supply and demand disruption that take place. So let me move over to my next slide. And since I spoke about the 9 baje 9 minute event, let me explain, and this is out of POSOCO, which is the system operator. This is the sequence of event that started to happen. Now, if you see the first at 8:30 p.m., 2030, because all of us knew, all of us as in the people who were managing the grid, knew that at 9 p.m., the lighting load in the country is nearly about 20%. So we knew that this demand is going to fall. And therefore, at 2030 or 8:30 p.m., thermal generation was asked to go down, right? Nearer to the event, at about 8:46, the hydro was asked to ramp down. And at 9 p.m., it was only hydro which was managing the whole thing. As we move ahead towards, as you say, there are other things as well. At about 8:45, the All India demand started to fall. Then the gas stations were also asked to switch to ramp down, because they need about 8 to 9 minutes, as I just mentioned. And the total ramp down was about 4 gigawatts. Hydro was the only station which was there. 2109, the demand was at the bottom, and suddenly it rebounded, and it was only hydro which was able to take the ramp up. And therefore, why this distinction between there was a total demand drop of 32 gigawatts, including the forced ramp down that was taken by, as you can see in the sheet, but the real event caused a demand disruption of nearly 15 gigawatts. Now, why these are classified into three things is because of the characteristics of these power generating stations. Hydro, you can ramp up, ramp down instantaneously. All you have to do is to close the water which is going to the turbine. That's it, and immediately it will stop. And you can again immediately, the moment the event goes out, you can open the tunnel, and the water starts coming in, and it immediately starts generating. Gas takes a while. It takes about, as I mentioned, 7 to 8 minutes. Now, what this has done, and again, let me tell you what was actually done here. I mentioned hydro played a critical role, as you can see in this chart. Now, all these hydro plants are actually part of the power market, in the sense the hydro plants have a power purchase agreement with various states and distribution companies. They provide power in a normal basis as per the power purchase agreement. They were taken out, and by taking out the governance of these hydro power stations, nearly 15 gigawatt in capacity, was taken over by the system operator. In a sense, if you can try and visualize what I'm trying to say, there is a big bucket which is power market, which has hydro power plants, which has gas power plants, has thermal power plants. They are tied PPAs. There's something is sold in the exchange, and there is a way of buying and selling power. These hydro power stations were taken out from what they were normally doing for about 4 hours, and they were given, their governance was handed over to system operator. Because otherwise you can't ask a hydro power plant to ramp down or ramp up, because they are supplying power to someone else. So that is the first, this is the basic, if you ask me, for the first time in this country, and at least in the last 2 decades, I have been in the power sector, where anything like this has happened, where you created a separate instrument by which you manage the grid technically. Financially and policy wise, what lessons that it shows? That if there is likely to be an event like this in the future, and I'll come to that, how this event can happen or cannot happen, then unless you have something in your control which is outside of the power market, and depending upon the severity of the disruption, there will be a massive impact on the grid. So this is the first real instance where the country and people who are in the power sector realized the need for a market which is called the ancillary services market or the balancing market outside of the power market. Now, what were the other learnings from this event? The other basic learning was, here, post the Honorable Prime Minister's call, there was a time of maybe 48 hours to plan all this, that you were able to figure out which is the most appropriate hydro station that can be used, or a set of hydro stations. Now, what if this disruption happens in maybe 4 minutes notice? Can we still do what we were able to do? Quite frankly, no. Because, as I said, these are tied into the power markets. Why should UP, or let's say West Bengal, or any other state which is enjoying a relatively low cost power, let's say from Tehri Hydro project or Purulia power project, any other, why should it allow this project to power, this hydro station, to be taken over by someone else? Because the states have paid for the power all this while, and therefore this will possibly not happen. And even if it happens, we have calculated, if this 15 gigawatt of hydro power stations are taken out and put in a separate entity, almost 1 lakh crore worth of damages will need to be paid to the states for compensation, and very rightly so. They can't, the system operator cannot say no. So what is the alternative? But before I go to the alternative, will this or can this event happen again? So let's intuitively think, and we have a set of brilliant researchers and students, and also faculty here. As I said, these events happen, demand disruptions or supply disruptions. All right, demand disruptions, you can still say that you can manage demand disruptions unless there is some catastrophe that is beyond you. A natural calamity happens and suddenly the demand drops. That's a separate matter, and we're not discussing that. But can there be supply disruptions, at least of the order that we saw on the 5th of April? So here is what our thinking is. We are headed towards 175 gigawatt of wind and solar. And the time that the government has put together for that to happen is in the next 2 or 3 years. Now, let me go to another, and I'll explain this. Don't. It's a busy slide, but I'll explain what I'm trying to say. Now, this is so we are headed towards 170 gigawatts of renewable energy. Renewable energy, as all of us know, is infirm by nature. I mean, you can't really fully predict how much of solar, how much of wind you're going to get every single day. It all depends on many things. There are forecasting techniques worldwide, but even the best forecasting technique and models have an error of between 3 and 5%. And I'm talking about those models and mechanisms where the accuracy rate is very high, that use machine learning, that use all kinds of weather data, etc., etc. Otherwise, in regulations, about 10% variation is allowed by virtually all regulators for wind and solar. So let me come to this chart. The first thing on the left is the ramp up and ramp down events that happened in financial year 2017 and financial year 2018. Most of it is, and this is how much of ancillary services were actually used. This is what is the compilation. You see, ramp down services were not needed much because, as I said, demand side, it is easier to manage. So because of increasing penetration of renewable energy into our grid, between 2 years, 1 year, 17 and 18, the number of events nearly doubled. Just to explain more, these events are events of time where a scheduled renewable energy, let's say was 100 megawatt, did not meet 100 megawatt of requirement. And therefore, to balance the grid, you had to ask a thermal generating station to put in the balance. Such events increased in 1 year by nearly 100%, nearly. All right. During this time, the integration of energy, renewable energy into the grid went up only by 30%, from nearly about 7% to just over 9%. At the moment, we are nearly 10% integration of renewables in the overall energy mix. I'm not talking about megawatt, now I'm talking about energy. Now, in a 30% jump, you saw the disruptions becoming twice. When we reach 175 gigawatts, which is in the next 2 or 3 years, the renewable energy that will be needed to be integrated will reach a level of nearly 20%. Now, once you reach 20%, and let's say, let's say in 2025, we have a renewable energy capacity of, let's say, 300 gigawatts. And let's say everything improves very much, the forecasting techniques, everything else, you still have 3 to 4% error in forecasting. Now, if there is a 3 to 4% error in 2025, and these errors happen instantaneously, remember, they will not be scheduled, they will not be planned in advance. They may give you maybe a 5-minute notice or maybe a half an hour notice, that's about it. But usually it is less than 5 minutes, as the world experience has shown. And therefore, if let's say 3 or 4% outages happen from renewable energy on a combined base of 300 to 350 gigawatts, you are staring at a supply disruption which is very close to what happened on 5th of April. Now imagine a scenario where you don't have the luxury of hydropower stations that you used to balance on the 5th of April, and you have a similar event of 12 to 15 gigawatt of supply disruption. Where do you go? And what is the answer? The only other answer that exists is batteries, because battery energy storage has exactly the same characteristics as a hydropower station. So let me, and perhaps this is my last slide, and I'll spend some time. So this I've just picked up from an International Energy Agency study that they had done, a global study as to because this issue is not just a thing for India. Many countries have actually crossed that 20% limit or 25% limit. It all depends upon what kind of energy mix or a demand supply mix the country has. So they have divided this into 6 phases, right? As it is, phase 1, VRE is variable renewable energy. That's what VRE means. In phase 1 and 2, the impact is moderate. Basically, when the penetration is what the levels at which India is today, is kind of up to phase 3 is where we have seen various countries' data. Up to phase 3 is about 15 to 20% penetration. Now, as we move towards 4, 5, and 6, it becomes much harder for the system operator to really manage the grid if there are no ancillary services available at his or her command. So we have, in fact, the IA study, I would recommend, it's available on the Niti Aayog website. They've done a specific study for India, and it was released, I think, in January this year. It's a very useful study. It will be helpful for anyone who is interested in this. They have mapped out states, and some states are already at phase 4. I mean, India as a country is large, but states like Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, parts of Gujarat, Discom, they are already much above 20% in terms of renewable energy integration. In fact, this is a big problem that particularly Tamil Nadu faces, has the maximum wind projects with them. And I think they have 5 gigawatts of wind, which they have signed PPAs for. The variation is between 500 and 5,000 megawatts. So that is a big challenge coming here. So let me, yeah. I've said most of it. And we have been looking very closely at various international models as to what is it that, how the other countries have managed this whole thing. For example, UK, and why we are picking up UK is that we also operate in that country. We have a massive investment in a gas based business in the UK. And therefore, I mean, I've said all this. Let me add one more point to this whole discussion, and then I'll try and put this all together. There's another very interesting thing that happens, and I don't know how many of you have been following Delhi's demand every single year, the peak demand. Forget about the lockdown, it's a different thing. Between last year and the year before last, Delhi's demand went up from nearly 6,500 megawatt to an upwards of 8,000 megawatt peak demand. And 80% of that demand, 70 to 80% of that demand was because of cooling. Now that's a big challenge that is facing all of us. And let me again give you some numbers. As of now, the household penetration of air conditioners in India is less than 10%. It may surprise some of you because all of us live in Delhi and we rarely see a house which does not have an air conditioner. But I'm talking about 250 million households in the country. The average penetration of air conditioners is still less than 10%. This was the same situation as China was in early 1980s. Today, China's air conditioner penetration is more than 100, which means on an average, a household has more than one air conditioner. And there's a Lawrence Berkeley National Lab in the US, which did this study a couple of years ago for Ministry of Power. And they presume that by 2030, this 10% or less becomes 30% penetration by 2030. The incremental cooling demand in this country will be 150 gigawatt just for that, for cooling. Now, what does cooling do? The cooling makes grid much more peakier. And this is a worldwide trend, which means people don't use air conditioners for all the day. And I'll give you another example, a very intuitive example. We were doing load research for all the distribution companies in India, but in Delhi we found in the South Delhi distribution company, they had a very peculiar trend. They had a peak demand of 400 megawatts between 3:30 p.m. and 4 p.m. And they were really, it is something which, if you ask any grid person, it's actually bizarre, because most of the peak demand either you see in the morning or you see at 6 p.m. onwards. But this 400 megawatt comes up at 3:30 p.m. and 4 p.m. So since we are doing this, we became slightly more curious about it and started to do surveys of talking to people. That is the time children come back from school. The moment they enter their houses, all air conditioners, everything is put on. At 4 p.m. they leave either for studies or for playing or whatever. Now, this is what I was saying. Now, you have high proportion of renewable energy. You have high cooling requirement. And cooling requirement, as I said, is not stable. It is going up and down. You have a variable demand, you have a variable supply. It is going to be a very, very big challenge as far as this country is concerned, given our ambition, what we have said in the international forums, in the Paris Agreement, that 40% of our energy in 2030 is going to only come from renewable energy. There's another facet of it, which I must mention. We are also looking at, as a nation, looking at electrification of our transport. Now, what is that? Again, a very simple example. Let's say Amity University decide that we will, and I hope you do, that you will electrify some portion or X portion of your fleet, whether it is hired or whether it is owned by the university or anybody else. And let's, for example, 100 MGs or these Konas are inducted in your fleet. Now, each Kona has a 40 kilowatt hour of battery. If you have 100, you're only talking about 4 megawatt of load, which will come and plug into your offices, maybe for 10 minutes. Again, I'm talking about a peakier grid. Now, in my last segment, while I've tried to put a doomsday picture, which actually it is not, is there a way forward? Yes, very much, absolutely. How have other countries done that? Very simple. UK and a host of other countries have created a market outside of the power markets, called the ancillary services market. Some call it capacity market. UK calls it short-term operating reserves. What they do here is they specify that I need response in these. This is the response time I need from as I said, could be less than 1 minute, could be less than 10 minutes, and so on and so forth. And they do a public auction and ask people to bid. And most of it is decentralized. There's another debate whether I mentioned 4 gigawatt of primary reserve is required. Do you keep 4 gigawatt of batteries at one place, or you distribute them across near load centers? UK has followed the distributed model. And what they do is they do an auction. It's called the capacity auction. And people bid for capacity, which is nothing, I'm sure all of you know, India works on a two-part tariff. There's a fixed charge and there's a variable charge, right? It is the same thing. Except in India, the fixed charge is determined by the regulatory commission. Here, it's a much more transparent, open process by which they are asking investors and power developers to bid. So let's say, and let me give you a number. The first round of auctions was done in 2015, and the capacity charge that came up was 23,000 pounds per megawatt, which means the system operator, if you put together 10 megawatt of either battery or decentralized gas, they will give you 230,000 pounds every single year for the next 10 years. Now, because you have bid we will presume as a regulator that your fixed charge is taken care of. Now, these ancillary services are only used maybe for half an hour every single day, not more. And that is where the decentralized model works beautifully, because let's give you an example. Let's take Amity University, right? You have a very large campus, maybe 10 megawatt of demand, power demand. I'm just throwing out numbers. You use those 10 megawatt for what? You have electricity, of course, lighting. Then you have large central air conditioning plants that also uses electricity. And you also have kitchens, and you also have other requirements of hot water. Now, instead of that 10 megawatt load, I come to you and say, I will put up a 5 megawatt of decentralized gas station, right? I will generate gas. Gas is available, the pipe natural gas which exists. I can generate electricity using the gas. The waste heat that comes out of the gas generator, as you know, only 40% of energy, in energy terms, only 40% is converted into electricity. I will trap the waste heat through a process of vapor absorption machine. Slightly, I'm getting technical into it. And I'll provide you with the cooling that you have. And the output of this vapor absorption process is a 70-degree water. So suddenly your 10 megawatt has got dropped to 5 megawatt. Now, if there are ancillary service regulations, for half an hour when your school is not, as the classes have not started, I can provide these services to the grid. So what have I done? On a single asset, which is an engine, gas engine, I have created 4 revenue streams, and everybody gets affordable energy. Maybe Amity's energy bill goes down by 30-40%. The grid operator, who would otherwise pay, let's say, 4 rupees for balancing, pays maybe 2 rupees. Similar thing, intuitively, if you can figure out, we are seeing a lot of electric vehicles coming on the road. You must have seen charging stations, and several of them ESL has installed in the Delhi NCR region. Each one of these charging stations is about 150 kilowatt of load. What if I turn this into a battery storage-based charging station? And just presume I do 1,000 charging stations in Delhi, each with a load of 150 kilowatt. I have 150 megawatt hour of storage. But of course, battery is expensive. So while I can do that, but if there are if there is a requirement of ancillary service, very much like what I mentioned UK did, certainly operators like us and many others will actually start creating these storage assets near the demand center. You may have seen in Noida, we have installed this at Sector 18. If you come to Delhi, we have charging stations at Khan Markets, at Connaught Place. This is where you need to balance load. You can do demand response. So again, on that same asset class, which is the battery, you create multiple different business models. And that is where, in my last segment, the role of regulators becomes a critical element. As I mentioned, India does have ancillary services regulation. It has been there since 2015 when the renewable energy started to take shape. But that only allows thermal generating plants having excess capacity to participate. So these are all capex heavy investments. As far as the distribution companies are concerned, they are also regulated. Incur any expenditure without the approval of the regulators, whether central or state. So you have to have a regulatory regime which allows for other asset classes to be recognized. So what the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission has in 2018 come out with a discussion paper where they are enlarging the scope of ancillary services. Much in the same manner as I explained, possibly moving towards the model that has already been successful in stabilizing the grid in the UK. In fact, you may be reading report that there were days in UK, particularly during the lockdown, when they never used the coal power plant. And that you can only do in combination of ancillary services and renewable energy. you need a combination of the two, and then you can possibly go low on thermal power station. So what is needed, and I would say it's a very timely webinar that Amity has done. Coming back to what I started off with, we are staring at nearly 20% renewable energy integration in the next 2 to 3 years. And unless the regulators act now, because getting a gas station made cannot happen in 6 months' time. You need very large investments. You need to plan right now. The regulations have to be in place so that if I as an investor needs to invest in these assets, I need at least 3 to 4 years for the project. The two events that I mentioned, the one, can you hear me? Yeah. So the one on 5th of April, and more recently the solar eclipse, though it happened during the day, there is no doubt left in our mind that the time for ancillary services is actually not now, it was yesterday, if you ask. So with this, let me stop. I'll be happy to take any questions, any comments, any suggestions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kumar, for the session. I think, all of us are somewhere touched by the power industry or the power sector in some manner, but yet we know so little of the ancillary services. And it's good that you enlightened us of what these ancillary services are and how they are beneficial. I'll quickly hand it over to my colleagues, Anuj Prakash and Professor Smita Sharma. I'll just have one question which has been asked by our student. There's a lot of talk about the renewable energy and less dependency on the fossil fuels. Do you think it is still a very long way ahead for a country like India to get into the major power to come from the renewable sources, and do we still have to depend a lot on fossil fuels?
Well, a very good question. Well, the answer can be both yes or no, and I'll tell you why. Yes, if we don't act in a manner that we need to act in terms of the regulatory and the policy processes. No, if you have seen very recently, there's a round-the-clock power bid that came up, one of the SECI Solar Energy Corporation bid, and that rate was ₹2.90. It was solar plus storage. Now, ₹2.90 for a solar plus storage, which is only going to fall given the panel prices are going down, the battery prices will go down, are going down, is actually lower than the new thermal power plant that you will erect. Certainly much lesser than the gas power plant that you have. So certainly if a lot of push incentives are given to solar plus storage plants, very, very much possible in the very near future that you can actually beat this whole curve.
Thank you, Mr. Kumar. And, as you rightly mentioned about Amity as well, Amity has done its bid where, major power comes through the solar panels. So on top of all our buildings in Amity, you'll see a lot of solar panels. So the energy being generated through those panels. So over to you, Anuj, for the next set of questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Gaurav. Thank you, Mr. Saurabh, sir. A very immersive and eye-opening presentation. So I had a couple of questions, sir. So as you mentioned, sir, in Delhi, the power usage is 8,400 megawatts, and it's 70 to 80% is for cooling. And that's a significant amount. And in fact, in the coming years, the power supply, the demand is going to be increasing. So there have been 2 thermal plants that have closed down in Delhi. So being at ITO and due to environmental issues, although this is a very positive effort for the environment and a very big welcome move, how do we meet the increasing demand of power? And we're also talking about, like you mentioned again, electric cars, electric vehicles. So this will also consume power and have the demand for increased power supply. So what are the feasible environmentally friendly energy sources that can be implemented for Delhi NCR? And how feasible or realistic is the production of energy, of nuclear energy? In fact, I remember there was talk about a nuclear power plant being set up in Jaitapur in Maharashtra, but that was met with a lot of environmental concerns and issues. So is this a real concern, and what are your views on that, sir?
So let me take the last part of the question on the nuclear energy. So
Yes.
nuclear energy by all means, whether from the climate perspective, from any other perspective, is perhaps the cleanest energy that you have. The problem with nuclear energy is the radioactive waste that comes out and its disposal. But more than that, India doesn't have uranium, and this whole issue of the NSG, as it is called, the or NPT as it is called, one of those international treaties. And if you recollect, maybe a decade ago, the famous India-US nuclear accord was basically to beat around all these problems, because it says unless you sign the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, the supplies of uranium cannot be given to any country, and that's where so to cut a long story short, I don't think India has enough fuel to have new nuclear plants. It's about 3 to 4% of the overall energy mix. Now coming to Delhi, yes, all these Badarpur and the other plant that you mentioned have been closed down. But look, now India is on a synchronous grid, and there is enough power capacity which is available within the country. So that's what the Delhi is doing. It is sourcing power. Of course, if you have your in-house own generating stations, your cost of supply of power procurement goes down. But let me also mention, in that 8,000 megawatt procurement or whatever that peak demand is, you're supposed to have 5% from renewable energy. That's a regulation. Delhi is at 0.1 or 0.2% at this moment. Now, with the increasing demand, and particularly that of cooling, and what I mentioned was not 70% of the overall 8,000 is not cooling demand. It is the incremental increase every year. 70% is because of cooling. Now, with this scenario, it will become completely very, very difficult for discoms in Delhi to manage load. And one of them, I don't know if you're aware, Tata Power has experimented and put together a 10 megawatt hour battery storage plant. In fact, you must take your students there. It will be a good visit to an actual functioning battery storage plant, and they are actually benefiting a lot from it. So yes, as I said, you need to have batteries to store renewable energy, particularly in a scenario where the demand is going very, very quickly up due to cooling.
Thank you, sir. So this leads me to my other question. There's been talk about solar fields of generating electricity, and is that something that we can look for in North India, like as it's being done? I think maybe in China and US also in a significant way, and it has shown some considerable generation of power. So can we look at these options for Delhi NCR?
So are you talking about solar farms?
So solar, in which the huge, yes, solar farms which have the solar panels.
No, so we have many large projects, solar farms of even 5 gigawatts are being constructed. I don't think in Delhi you will be able to do that because there's just no land available in Delhi. But it doesn't really matter where the power is generated with the synchronous grid that we have. Look, while this is all a very great idea and people have invested heavily on very large power plants, let me tell you the problems of a large power plant, particularly solar. And some of it, if you're following the sector, you will see from the investor perspective. As I mentioned, in a normal power purchase agreement that you do with any state, whether you are gas-based power plant or a thermal power plant, it is on a two-part tariff. One is a fixed charge, which takes care of all your investment, your depreciation, your salaries, and the other is your fuel charge. And that fuel charge is essentially how much coal you are procuring, and that is a pass-through. Or gas, how much you are procuring. In hydro, there is no fuel charge, it's all fixed cost. In a solar generation, it's a single part tariff. right? So what you hear 3 rupees or 5 rupees or whatever that number is only one part tariff, which means if you are giving me 100 megawatt of power and I don't schedule that power, you will not get paid for it as per the contract. And why does it happen? The solar generation, the highest solar generation happens between 11 a.m. or 12 noon to about 3 or 4 p.m. Now, this is the time most part of the country there is no demand. The demand is actually low. Now, if let's say I'm Delhi and I need 8,000 megawatt in 6 p.m. But during the time that solar is there, I only need 4,000 megawatt, which I have already scheduled. Now, I have signed a PPA with you, Anuj, and you are, let's say 100 megawatt. I will tell, if I take that 3 rupee power, what happens is there is another grid discipline penalty that is levied, and that is to do with frequency. It's all about stabilization of the grid. So every entity connected to the grid, whether it is the distribution company or the generating station, has to maintain frequency between a very narrow band, between 49.7 to about 50.2 hertz. That's all. The moment you exceed up and down, there's penalties, and penalties are as high as about 5 to 6 rupees per unit. This is to discourage, this is a way of load management. Now, if my frequency at let's say 3 p.m. is within that range, but if I schedule your power and I don't use it because I have no demand, I have to pay another 5 rupees. And therefore, you have seen a lot of utilities in the countries, Rajasthan, Andhra, who have threatened to renege the power purchase agreements for renewable energy people. And therefore, a new concept of what is called deemed generation has come up, because I'm an investor. I have signed a PPA committing you that I will give you this much of power, and you have signed it also. Now, you can't dishonor the contract. If you dishonor, at least give me the fixed charge. So these are the technical problems of renewable energy, and therefore I am not a big fan of these very large power. However, what we are doing in Maharashtra, let me mention to you. Maharashtra has a agriculture load of nearly 9,000 megawatt for agriculture pumps. They get subsidy because, as you know, agriculture consumption is all subsidized by the government. Farmers don't pay anything. They get subsidy at about 3 rupees per unit. But because these are remote areas and long lines have to be transmission lines have to be installed, their average cost of supply to rural areas is about 7 rupees. They get about 3 rupees from the government. 4 rupees is uncovered loss. You can't charge the farmer anything. We went to them. They have very large tracts of land, either owned by the distribution company or gram panchayat, which are unusable. You can't cultivate anything. We have on those, we have installed decentralized power plant between half a megawatt to 10 megawatt, depending upon the size of the land. We have completed 100 megawatts of installation. The power cost tariff is 3 rupees per unit. And therefore, you can meet or actually exceed your, and there is no instability on the grid. That because agriculture and power, pumping and solar power exactly match. When there is sunlight, I need electricity to pump water. When it is raining, I don't. So there is no mismatch between demand and supply of the kind that we see in, which I just mentioned, the case of Delhi. They are very happy. They're benefiting financially. Farmers are benefiting because they are getting electricity during the day. Most of the states actually give you power in the night. And a poor farmer has to, middle of the night, go and switch on his pump and switch it off sometimes later. If you just solarize agriculture, nothing else, in a decentralized manner, and we have shown that it is possible, it makes commercially a lot of sense. 350 gigawatt of power, you can solar power you can consume in agriculture, which is almost the same or maybe twice your ambition which exists today. It will not imbalance the grid because it is right at the demand center. It is solving your problem because you pay 90,000 crores every single year for agriculture subsidy. It will improve the health of the distribution companies as well. So this is what I would say There are large farms, but we need smaller but many numbers of decentralized solar applications.
Thank you so much, sir. Very nice, sir. Good answer, sir. Thank you. Very informative. So I'll hand over the session to Ms. Smita. Over to you, Smita, ma'am. Smita, ma'am, your mic is muted.
Thank you so much, sir. I would like to extend a warm welcome. Thank you so much for wonderful thoughts and enlightening our students. We really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us. I would like to ask a question that, as per your opinion, what would be the role of government to make it better, or what are you looking at any specific assistance from the government?
No, there's no assistance that is needed. As I said, power, like all infrastructure, is a market. It's actually not a market, and therefore you need regulations to enable investments in those markets. While we have regulations so that people can install or make investments in thermal power plants, hydropower plants, renewable energy power plants, there are no regulations at the moment which allow for investments in batteries for ancillary services or gas-based generation for ancillary services. That's what I was mentioning, that what the government needs to do is to come out with those regulations, be very clear, be as open as possible, allow people, as many people as possible, enlarge the competition. It is only going to benefit.
Thank you, Mr. Kumar. There are a lot of questions which have poured in, but due to the paucity of the time, we will not be able to take all those questions. But I'll quickly take one which is pondered over our minds a lot. Just as you mentioned, 9 baje, 9 minute, affected the grids, and there was a lot of news articles, and there was a lot of debates on this particular sense that what will happen at 9 p.m. if everyone shuts off electricity. So one of the pertinent questions that has been asked by Mr. Anil Kumar Chaudhary, he's a senior vice president out of our Great Noida campus, is due to the lockdown, majorly the power is consumed by the heavy industries and office spaces. But suddenly there was a lockdown in March, and it continued for quite a while. Was there a similar problem that all of the power companies faced due to the lockdown as well, just like 9 baje, 9 minute?
No, absolutely. Look, these things, the interruption and disruption that we just spoke about, happened for a moment, for an instant. As you saw, 9 baje, 9 minute happened for 9 minutes. The solar eclipse happened for about 20 minutes. In normal cases, what I talked about, 5% disruption in renewable energy, will happen only for about maybe 20 minutes or so. What we're talking about, the lockdown, is a very different story. All of us knew on a particular evening that from tomorrow it's a lockdown, including the distribution companies. So they knew that, of course, the demand will be only household demand, and there's enough time to plan for it. So that's really a different problem erupted. That's a separate matter, but certainly not, it was not an instantaneous decision. But yes, if we were, let's say at 10 p.m., we were told no, at 11 p.m. you switch off everything. Yes, a similar thing would happen, but certainly not an ancillary type of a disruption.
Thank you, Mr. Kumar. I think brilliant answers to those questions. We have, as I said, more questions pouring in. Probably if you would have time, we would request Ms. Chavi to share those questions with you that you can answer in your spare time with us. So on behalf of the entire Amity family, on behalf of our Group Vice Chancellor, Professor Dr. Gurinder Singh, sir, he's the force behind these webinars, for motivating us, for reaching out to speakers such as yourself, and coming on to this platform, speaking to our students, speaking to our faculties. And I also thank my panelists, Mr. Anuj Prakash and Professor Smita Sharma, for joining in and asking those pertinent questions, and to all the faculty members and the students, and to the IT team, Sudhanshuji, for being a wonderful host and helping us go through with these webinars. So thank you once again, Mr. Kumar, for coming over to this platform and speaking to us.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Gaurav.
Thank you so much, sir.